Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank the World Affairs Council and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. And I'm going to turn this over to Robert Seidenschwartz to introduce our panelists and to lead this event.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Seidenschwartz. I'm the president for the Montana World Affairs Council, which is making this program possible. It's the council in the classroom. So I've got two very distinguished speakers. I'd like to introduce Dr. Bradley Layton and Arnie Sherman. So I'm going to ask them to give a little bit of a background on themselves, and then, of course, we'll describe what the discussion is going to be. And I want you to pay attention because you will be graded. So anybody, head on desk, looking the other way, writing, I'm watching you. You can see me, I can see you. So only kidding, guys. So I'd like to have Dr. Layton give a little bit of background on himself, please.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. It is really me. I'm wearing a tie, so I'll go ahead and reintroduce myself a little bit because I know this is being broadcast, so it's out there on the web for the all to see.
Yep.
And so, as we were just discussing a little bit ago, I grew up in the small town, Seymour, Indiana. From there, I went to college on the East Coast at MIT and became very interested in human power. My undergrad advisor was Dave Wilson. If you get a chance, look him up. He's on Wikipedia. From there, I used my own human power to be on the United States rowing team for a little bit. Before my brain totally gave out, I went back to grad school. Got a PhD in biomedical engineering at the University of Michigan. From there, I went on to the faculty at Drexel University, where I was really trying to balance the biomedical engineering side of things with my lifelong passion for human power. From there, I became a faculty member at the University of Montana, where I direct the energy technology program, where we focus on renewable energy and the broader aspects of its implications. So thanks for having me, Bob.
Well, thank you and welcome. Arnie Sherman, to my right or to your left. So Arnie, if you would give a little background on yourself.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. You all look bright and eager to participate today. We're looking forward to your interaction and your questions. For the last 20 years, I've lived here in Montana, but that's not kept me from doing business around the world. I've traveled and worked in almost 100 countries. I grew up originally in New York City, went to college and graduate school in Ohio. Started my career in a completely different area, doing human service work, ran runaway shelters and halfway houses for ex-convicts and delinquency prevention programs, and then got involved in leadership development, youth leadership development, and then migrated over doing international business in emerging markets. I had a office in Russia and the Soviet Union for 10 years. I run an international financial advisory company now that has offices in Zhuhai, China. And as we end up talking about the energy future and the effect on business, I will share an email that just came into me from a person who works for me in China, who said he's just got some beautiful photos of Montana on a day in China when the sky and the air looks like Campbell's bean and bacon soup.
Wow.
And I can tell you from being in China that that's a typical day in many of the markets around China, many of the cities around China, where you can't see 50 feet in front of you, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon it looks like 2 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
So I've represented companies, as I said, around the world and done business in many different industries and sectors. For the past 17 years, I ran the World Trade Center, which is headquartered at the University of Montana. And I think I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about how all of these issues that you've been discussing and we'll talk about today play out in the global marketplace.
So that's actually it's a perfect segue in terms of what Arnie just said in regards to a typical day in a Chinese city. What we want to discuss with you today is how do we kind of get our heads around the future demands that will be required to meet our energy needs and balancing that with some of our concerns about the environment. There's a multitude of challenges that we face, which job creation, economic opportunity and stability, population growth, which is one of the things that we're going to focus on. We're going to give you some perspective of what population on the planet is going to look like by 2050 by most estimates, and then kind of work back from there to talk about the areas and challenges that we are going to face, and the focus will be on how do we meet those needs? How do we meet food needs, housing needs, job opportunities, institutional accountability by the governments running the various countries? So this is going to be a part of the discussion. We also encourage you, please, if you have a question, just raise your hand, we'll acknowledge, and we want this to be a give and take discussion, not us just talking to you, and then of course, you just sitting there listening. We want this to be an interactive discussion with the three of us. So I'd like to start with just a couple of figures that I think are pretty compelling. We have roughly about 70 billion people on the planet right now. The United States has, I think, about 350 million people. By 2050, they estimate the population on the planet will be closer to about 9 billion people. Most of that growth is going to take place in the Asian markets, Middle East, where you'll see population increases, and Africa in particular will be the fastest growing continent, and you have to look at specific countries to see where those population increases are going to be coming from. That presents particular challenges. China right now is the largest population on the planet. That will be supplanted by India in the not too distant future. So India will have over 1.6 billion people, they estimate, in the not too distant future. So just a little bit of a framework and perspective. So let's talk about, because Arnie mentioned he's traveled on a global basis. So I'd like him to describe some of the cities in China to give perspective. And I know Moore, Stanford, Cutbank, look, even Missoula, we're a tiny little city in the scheme of things. But I think Arnie will open some eyes when he describes Chinese cities. And I don't know, have you been to India, Arnie?
Yes.
And talk a little bit about India.
And Russia and Africa,
yeah.
and I've been to every continent.
Yeah. So let's get some perspective from a gentleman that's been there.
Well, here's one thing that always boggles my mind and probably would have the same effect on you. In the United States, we have 12 cities with more than 1 million people.
Yeah.
In China, there are 220 cities with more than 1 million people.
Yeah.
And many of the cities, particularly the coastal cities, like Tianjin and Shanghai and Shenzhen, have on any given day between 30 and 50 million people living and working in these cities. The issues of environment and human waste disposal and energy use are just beyond comprehension. We have an office that's very close to the city of Shenzhen that probably most of you haven't heard of, and I'd say most Americans probably don't know of. It's a city of 35 million. It's an industrial city. It's about an hour ferry ride from Hong Kong. I was there a year ago, and I was in the business district of the city. It's called the Fujian district, and I looked around, and there were about a dozen skyscrapers in that area. One of them in particular was very interesting to me. It was about a 90-story building, and around it, it had a 5-story, looked like a wedding ring, built around it. And those were the executive premier offices. And why they were executive and premier was they could move up and down the building to be above the smog and the clouds to allow the people to see a clear sky, which was, which demonstrated there was an anticipation that there wasn't going to be a clear sky for some time in the future to be able to build a building like that. I went back 1 year later, and on that same street there were another 40 skyscrapers that weren't there 1 year earlier.
Wow.
Half of the world's construction cranes are in one country, in China. On the other hand, you can look beside the population issues. There is a coal-fired power plant going online every single week in China, 50 a year. I flew inland 3.5 hours on a jet plane to a town called Xi'an, which is known because they have a thing called the Terracotta Warriors, which is a very interesting historical site. This is considered an agricultural farming town, and not very close to the big industrial centers. But I can tell you, I was there for 3 days, and the air quality reminded me of Blade Runner every single day.
Wow. Good movie, by the way.
Yeah.
Great movie. The headlights were on all day long on cars. The power plants were spewing dust into the air. You could wash a car and 20 minutes later go outside and write your name on it. That's how much pollution was coming out of the air. And I would say 10 or 15% of the people walking around Xi'an were wearing masks on a daily basis.
And most of this is coming straight from the coal-fired power plants.
Correct.
Right? It just goes up in the air and comes down.
Right.
With very little control.
And one of the shocking things to me when you think about would you really live there is I went by one of the new coal power plants that was spewing dust and smog into the air. And literally 100 yards away, they were building million-dollar condominiums and a whole village. When they build in China, if there's 5 or 6 buildings that they're going to build, they build them all simultaneously. They don't build them one at a time. And these were going to be million-dollar apartments within 100 yards of a power plant spewing, dust and smog and smoke into the air. That's very, very typical. I think some of you may know that when they had the Olympics in China, they had a moratorium on factory production within 200 miles of the Olympic sites, which were in 2 cities. They were in Beijing and Tianjin, just so that the air quality wouldn't be as noticeable and as oppressive as it is here. Our U.S. ambassador, my last point on this, our U.S. ambassador, Max Baucus, who was our senator here for many years, is an ambassador to China, and he is a jogger. And by nature, and he goes out, here in Montana, he would go out for a jog every single morning. In Beijing, he jogs indoor at the embassy rather than going outdoors because of the air quality. So that just gives you some idea of one country, it's a large country, but what's going on in a place like China.
So I'd like to kind of bring this back to first, how does Montana participate in this? And Montana participates in this because what do we have as a resource that gets extracted from this state that gets shipped over to China? Any answers?
I bet Cutbank knows.
Yeah, let's call some of the schools. Cutbank, what do you guys think?
What do you guys got that goes to China?
What resource in the state of Montana is extracted that goes to China to what exactly Arnie just described in terms of usage?
Copper, beef, wheat, what else was there? Corn, stuff like that.
Well, we're
You're
missing,
on the right track, but you're missing the big one, the big C. The big C.
which we have 1/3 of all the
Coal?
American coal.
There you go.
Got it.
Is that
Coal.
true? 1/3.
We have
Yeah.
1/3 of all the extractable and usable coal in the United States.
We are the Saudi Arabia of coal in the United States, as Saudis are to oil.
Right.
And I'd like to kind of pivot off of that and just have Arnie for a minute describe in this city of 30 million people, what's the main mode of transportation? Because then I want to kind of pass it on to Dr. Layton in terms of power and generation, because China, since time began, was a rural population, and for the first time in its history, has about a 50-50 equilibrium now in terms of people living in rural areas and urban areas. And that's one of the great challenges going forward, because on a global basis, they estimate 2030, 2035, the world's population will be 70% urban. And
Living in the skyscrapers, at least.
living in the skyscrapers in these dense urban areas, which means they're going to use a lot more energy. As you move from rural to urban, the energy usage component ratchets up exponentially.
Right.
So, Arnie, would you please tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about how do people get around, and then let's turn this into some of the energy equivalents.
Well, in
that
the
your
last
expertise is in.
20 years, there's been the largest human migration in the history of the world in China. We talk about immigration coming to the United States, and one of the biggest, movements here was when the Irish came to mine, and back in the previous century and previous century before that, and that was a few million. China has moved hundreds of millions of people. In China, you cannot move from the equivalent of one county to another without government permission. You can't relocate. So it's a planned, government strategy to relocate, and they've moved hundreds of millions. I can tell you, when I first went to China in 1991, you could go in Beijing, and there would be 1,000 bicycles for one car. You would go by Tiananmen Square, the infamous Tiananmen Square, and it would just be bicycles everywhere. I was actually afraid to be in a car because it looked like you were going to kill people on bicycles, and it was almost like being with a school of fish. The car would go and the bicycles somehow would magically move out of the way and the car would get through.
They were in rhythm.
Right. Now you see no bicycles virtually, and it's just cars and cars. It has the most congestion I've seen almost anywhere in the world in terms of car utilization, and it's just going to
And it's
increase.
growing.
Yeah, these cities cannot handle 35 million people moving by cars. There are buses and there are trains, but the roads are, just from morning till night, bumper to bumper, moving, inching along, and people organize their lives around how the traffic patterns are flowing.
So I've got to ask this because this is very important insight, and then I want to have Dr. Layton talk about some of the human power and conversion and some of the things that he's working on. Sure. The question I ask is, why are people then moving into these type of conditions? There's a primary reason that they're leaving a rural existence, going to these urban centers, and everything that's being described in terms of the pollution, the congestion, but there's a reason that they're doing that.
Yeah.
So
economic vitality
right.
for work, for
Standard
jobs,
of living, correct?
For jobs and work, and to support their family, and to send back money to their, to the rural families. When you in China get a job with a company, unless there's some exceptional issue, you have a job for life.
Right.
They feed you, they house you. You work 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year. Yeah. You get a 2-week vacation. You go back and see your family. You're probably making $400 or $500 a month, but from that, because your housing is taken care of and your food is taken care of by your corporate parents, you can send money back to your families in the rural areas. It's strictly an economic decision, and it's also the government trying to move workers into the production areas of the country. China produces 50% of the world's consumables now.
So most of these jobs are in manufacturing, is that right?
There's a factory in Shenzhen that employs 700,000 people.
Which is almost the size of the state of Montana.
And almost anything I'm looking at, from your T-shirts to your jeans to your headphones are probably all made in China. Most of what I'm looking at in terms of consumable items, on the screen are manufactured in China. So it's a government. It's still a communist country. It's still centrally. It's a command economy, centrally controlled, and so they can decide we're going to move 25,000 people into this factory, and you just go and move.
So can I interject very quickly? One of the things I want to bring up 2 points. One of the reasons we're really focusing on China today is because there's a very exciting event that is happening at the university right now. And Bob, would you just take a moment to let our students know what's going on?
Happy to. Why we're speaking to you today is in coordination with the AMES Energy Conference, which is taking place right now at the university. It's today and tomorrow, and we've got speakers and political delegates from Korea, South Korea, China, and Japan, in addition to representation here in the United States. Arnie will be joining me later this evening on a panel. Dr. Layton will be also participating on a panel. So this is the largest energy conference, to my knowledge, that's taken place in the state of Montana to bring people inside education and understanding of the challenges that we face. So you are a direct participant in this conference, and because of technology, we're able to do this. So when we're talking about opportunities, how the world is changing, and what's going to be required, we're living this in real time right now. So very good question, and thank you.
And then the other thing is that before we go over to Dr. Layton, I would love to just open it up for a few questions, because I think that this is such an interesting topic, and I would like to open it up to our schools if you have any questions about what's been discussed so far.
I learned a lot from what you were just saying, Ari. So I'm getting a great education today, too.
Absolutely. Gardner, do you have any questions for our panel?
Somebody has to start with one question to break the ice. Do we have somebody down here?
There's one student there in Gardner with a question.
Okay, please.
They're discussing.
Yes.
We had a question on what's the culture like with all that, all the people, their stress levels.
What's the culture like and the stress levels in China? Was that the question?
I believe so.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Good.
Wait. Is that the question?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think that there's a lot of, from the people that I know, and we have partners in China. We have Chinese workers that work with us. We have a Montanan who married a Chinese woman who's running our office there, lives in China, and has a child. There's a lot of concern about environment and the pollution and all of the issues that energy use or misuse creates. And they all kind of look to live in my person lives in a building that has an air filtration system in the building, and when they get a chance to go away, they leave the country for the weekend. There's many Chinese that come to study in the United States. Right now, there are over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. And many of them would like to immigrate here. There's a backlog. It's about a 10 or 12-year wait in most of the immigration categories for Chinese who want to immigrate to the United States, because there's so many of them that when they get economic means, they want to leave the country.
Right.
And it's because of their children. They're very concerned about the future of their children, and they want their children to live in a clean environment. And while they don't criticize their government publicly, because that's sort of a no-no, you criticize everybody else's government, but not your own. Privately, when they have the ability to do that, they would like to leave. Sure. It just makes sense, and it's primarily because of the children's health.
Right.
Now let's go to another school. Cupbank, do you have any questions?
Looks like Cutbank's got all the answers there.
I know.
Got it all figured out.
Cupbank, do you have any questions or anything to add to the conversation?
Actually, I just want to add, we have an exchange student from China that's here
Right.
with us today. So I
Okay.
don't know if he has any comments or questions, or he had
Wearing the
mentioned
Vans
that
t-shirt.
$200 a month or $400 a month was pretty high for the pay scale. It's more like 200.
Well,
Yep. I was talking about in some of the bigger cities. But you're right.
Let's ask him his experience. What is your impressions of Montana, Cutbank, having come from China? Would you like to share some of that with us? Wide open spaces, blue sky, cold winters.
When I come, that's true. Montana, the weather in Montana is very good, and we can see the blue sky every day. But if you're in China, that's like dark.
Where are you from in China?
I'm from Shanghai.
Okay, so yes, in Shanghai it's very unusual to have a beautiful clear day where you can see everything. In Shanghai, it's a beautiful city. There's tremendous development. I can tell you, and you probably know this, in your city, in Pudong, which is the other side of the river, which has many skyscrapers. How many skyscrapers in Pudong?
I'm not in Pudong, so I'm not really sure.
Well, how many big buildings in Pudong?
Yeah, a lot. I think a whole bunch.
Yeah, well, I'd say there's several thousand, and I can tell you 15 years ago, 20 years ago, this part of the city was nothing but fields with bison, rice paddies and fields, and now there's hundreds and hundreds, as far as you can see, of what we would call here skyscrapers. And there are, on a typical day in Shanghai, between people living there and people visiting, 30-40 million people that have to live and work in the city.
So to put that in perspective, that would be Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and we exclude California combined.
Yes.
Population-wise, just in the western United States, compared to
in one city.
So-
And when I'm there, I think about things, just think about it. The magnitude of the issues and the problems of human waste disposal, for example, or providing water to 30 or 40 million people, or what would happen if the power went out,
Right.
if there was a power failure. When you have so many people in such a small space, it's a marvel that the city planners and the city managers can maintain a city like that every single day and deal with the daily life issues.
Hey, it's
that
like
you
going to
have
New York.
Yeah.
Every time I go back to New York, I'm in awe that this place works.
Yeah, but it's
amazing.
5 times the size.
Yeah, I know. So let's let Dr. Layton, if there's no additional questions, I'd like to have him talk a little bit about what he looks at in relation to energy.
Sure.
And let's have, as you listen to him, think about this in terms of what we've just discussed and what Arnie has described in a place like China with such a massive population, and the needs are all driven by some type of energy consumption. Nothing that he just talked about happens unless there's deliverability of energy, and how that energy is derived comes in many different forms. The majority of it is from electric generation in terms of what these cities and what these areas have to use. So, Dr. Layton, if you'd give a little dissertation for us.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Bob. And Arnie, great education there, bringing us up to speed on China. So I wanted to follow up with a question. I think it's the same question I asked about 3 weeks ago. Who was able to ride their bike to school today? Just want to get a show of hands. I'm just wondering if there are any more. I see one hand. Okay, so 2 hands maybe? I'm not sure. Because I think a few weeks ago, there was maybe only one person that rode their bike. I'm thinking now with the weather getting better, probably more of you are at least thinking about riding your bikes. When we talked last time, there were a few folks that lived within a couple miles of school. I was able to ride my bike today. I feel it's a privilege. We're very fortunate here in Missoula to have the bike lanes that we do. I do a lot of work with Bob Giordano at Free Cycles, and he says in a lot of ways Missoula is better than 90% of the cities in America in terms of our bicycle accessibility, and that does a lot to help the air quality. We're also very fortunate here in the United States that Missoula Valley, which actually has fairly bad air quality by Montana standards, we're lucky enough to receive some federal subsidies. Our federal government realizes that and says, hey, Missoula, we want to keep your air clean. And there's a little bit of money that flows in to improve our bike paths. So even yesterday, I discovered, gosh, there's a neat new little way to get through town and avoid the cars. And even this morning, I got here around 8. Allie and I were in the lecture hall here, and I said, gosh, do I have time to go get my business cards from my office? Because I'm going to meet a lot of these Asian dignitaries today, and I thought, gosh, I'd love to let them know a little bit about our renewable energy technology at the University of Montana. We can deliver our program online, and as we're experiencing right now, that's the way that education is going. So it's like, well, I think maybe, I don't know, you think you can make it across town? So I was able to make it from right here at Montech, and we're on the other side of the river and on the other side of some busy streets. I was able to get to my office in 10 minutes and get back here, and the poor cars were sitting there waiting on each other, and everyone was kind of stuck in their little metal cubes. And it sounds like in a lot of ways, China, despite their progress, has maybe gone backwards a little bit. And unfortunately, from what Arnie was saying, everyone's kind of stuck in their cars and honking and breathing all this exhaust. So in a lot of ways, we're very lucky to have the foresight in this country to keep our air clean and all that. So that's something I feel really lucky about. So if whatever you can do in your community, tell me a little bit about how safe you feel riding your bike, or reasons for maybe not riding your bicycle to get around. Like who was thinking that maybe they would ride their bike today but then didn't for some reason? That's kind of what I want to hear.
I'm also curious, if I remember correctly, Stanford had some rather long commutes. So let's go to Stanford to hear from this.
So I think there was one student there that raised his hand and said that maybe it was
if I rode my bike to school, I'd have to ride it about 26 miles.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
And I bet you're in pretty good shape having to do that.
Well, yeah, or you have to get up really early. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Shen, in my office, he's our electronics professor, is Chinese, and he said back when he was a child, when he was a student, he would in fact ride his bicycle 25 miles each way, and he did that really out of necessity in a lot of ways. I mean, there would be
He had no choice.
there would be lines. I mean, there were buses, but there would be these lines to get on the bus, and there just simply was not enough carbon fuel transportation to get him there. So he was more or less forced to. I choose to ride my bike because I feel like it's a luxury. I'm not stuck in traffic. I can, if I need to get on the sidewalk or get in a bike lane or get out in the middle of the road, I can always find a path. And so that's a freedom that I enjoy very much.
So, Dr. Layton, when we're talking about, obviously, riding a bike is a very low impact
Oh, sure.
type of way of getting around for transportation, non-polluting, except we do have to make the tires and the spokes, so it does come from some
Sure.
extraction resource somewhere. But talk a little bit about what you see happening in the alternative energy world and how that relates to this discussion that we're having right now in regards to China. Because China, as much as we are telling a story of how horrific the issues are, also recognizes that they cannot sustain the current path that they are on. They
Sure.
don't have clean water. They know that pollution is causing a lot of death by citizens who have asthma and other types of diseases associated with this. So China is very much in the forefront of recognizing this, and so are the citizens. They are demanding change. They're not just sitting back passively and saying, hey, it's okay, standard of living is better, we'll deal with this. So give a little insight to
I just want to add one point to that.
Yeah,
point to that. And they're looking at models like Iceland or Germany or Scandinavia, which have made significant commitments to alternative energy, and you might want to talk about what's happening there.
Right. So and herein lies the problem. So we met, one of the first questions that you were asked is, what's a big major export to China? And the answer was coal, of course. And what do we typically use coal to do? Well, we use it to make electricity.
Right.
One upside, and Bob was talking about earlier how people moving into the city might intensify the energy per person. And if you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the fact that each one of us uses 10 megajoules per day for our own metabolic energy. The average person uses 200 megajoules per day. The average North American is at 1,200. We've talked about that. Well, one upside typically of moving into cities is a lot of times the energy per person can go down. You don't have to drive 25 miles to get to the city. And so what we're likely to see, hopefully we'll see more of, are electric cars in big cities in China, which don't have the emissions. The problem is the coal is elsewhere. And I wanted to share with you some solutions actually that are happening right now in Montana. I've been working with a colleague. This is down in Stevensville, Montana, and this is a great story. So it comes from just one little family who heats their house with wood. We've been doing some other work with Darby High School. They were able to get a nice grant from the USDA to heat their school with wood. As you know, there's a lot of dead wood sitting around in Montana. In fact, we're sitting
Beetle kill.
In fact, we're sitting right in front of a beetle kill piece of artwork. So where I'm going with this is the energy per person sometimes can go down when you move to a city, but the technology that I'm describing, it's and this is a great little story. So if you get a chance, look up a Montanan by the name of Craig Thomas. He's one of my heroes, and he's got a book out there called Regurgitations of a Montana Forester, and probably a lot of you have dads and grandpas like this, but the story came out of just their own little family. He heats his house with wood. Well, as we know, just like when you burn coal or you burn wood, you're going to get some smoke. So his wife is there in the house and says, well, gosh, Craig, I love having a nice warm house, but how come every time the stove comes on, I've got to breathe that smoke? Can you do something about it? And sure enough, he did. He used good old American ingenuity and built a filter that now takes that smoke from the wood stove and puts it through this wood filter, again made with Montana wood. And now they've reduced the amount of carbon that comes out of it because he has living organisms in this filter that breathe that carbon. In itself, carbon dioxide is not a bad or evil gas. Plants need it, as we know. It also takes a lot of the particulates out of the air, and I think that's really what Arnie was talking about, all the coal and the ash. And if we do things right and be actual leaders in Montana and the U.S., we might actually be able to share some of those technologies with the Chinese, with the Asians, and actually provide solutions for some of the pollution problems they're having. So I think, as we realize, we're really all in this together at this point. We try to keep our own land clean, but at the same time, we're sort of exporting a lot of this dirty technology to China, and a lot of that comes back as carbon dioxide, and it's now a global problem. So I really see this Asia-Montana Energy Summit as a time to come together and solve these.
And that's what we're attempting to do, is to have people dialogue. I'll give you an example. South Korea gets about 40% of its electric generation from coal. Mm-hmm. They're not a resource-rich country. They have to import most of what they need to convert into some form of electricity or other type of energy usage. They're working on technology to use coal for electric generation, but to reduce the emissions to zero. So it's, Dr. Layton made a point about innovation and technological innovation, which is really a very critical hallmark of what distinguishes the United States from many other countries. You're a part of that. What your role may be in the future, yet to be determined. But please understand that innovation has been able to lend itself to many of the dire prophecies that were made years ago in terms of population, food, running out of resources. I was looking back on several environmental prophecies about doomsday that did not come to pass. Now, we can debate and discuss whether we should or shouldn't, but because of innovations that took place to meet these challenges, we were able to not have some of these things come to pass. So just an important takeaway for you to think about, how do you address these issues? Then the discussion becomes, should we? Consumption. Should we be on this track of how much we consume? Do we really need everything that we use? But I want to kind of turn that back again, too, because our lifestyles are at a very high level in Europe, the United States, and several other countries like South Korea, Australia, where we really do consume an awful lot. Now, the rest of the world, what do you think they want? So that's a question I'm posing to you. Look at our lifestyles and ask yourself about the emerging economies, and do you believe that they want to have lifestyles in terms of consumer goods and quality of life and opportunities similar to us?
I'd like to go to more because we have not heard from them yet
More?
today.
Come on,
What
more.
do you think?
Give us more. What kind of questions does this raise for you guys?
Pretty on the ball. I'm sure the gears are turning there.
Here we go.
Okay, we were wondering why the Chinese government doesn't require scrubbers on the smokestacks like some of the factories in the U.S. do.
That's a great question.
Great question.
It's a good question, and I think some of it is the reason we have scrubbers is because there was litigation and there was demand from the populace to do it, and there was the effects of the pollutants in the air and the particulates in the air. I think the Chinese are getting to that point that with a growing middle class, with 1 million people in China now that are millionaires and are raising children, there is demand to do that. The reason for not doing it is simply cost.
Exactly.
It's much more costly, and these plants operate on budgets. And truthfully, most of the environmental improvements in our country are a result of companies being forced to do things.
Being sued
To do it. I mean, there is an advantage of the legal system. There is a good use for litigation, and it is to force people to do stuff, because when there isn't rules and regulation, or they're not sued into it, they don't do it. I just read today about Duke Energy in North Carolina is providing bottled water to over 100 families whose wells have gotten polluted as a result of them storing ash from coal-fired power plants.
It ended up in the river.
It ended up in the river system, ended up in people's wells. They've been drinking it for a while, and now they can't drink it anymore, and the power company is offering bottled water to them.
Okay, we got 2 questions. We'll go to the young lady first. We'll get to the gentleman right after that. So please.
More.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
You're on.
Who owns all the factories in China? the government.
Well, who owns the factory? Most of them are considered privately owned by the energy companies, but the government owns a piece of almost all of them. So they're public-private in most cases. So the government owns a stake in the business, and then there's a private energy, publicly traded energy company that has, the coal plants. There's also, let's not forget, there's 26 nuclear power plants in China as well,
And more being built.
and 22 more being built.
Right.
And that, there's some people think that nuclear energy is a cleaner energy and maybe is less damaging to the environment. Of course, you had the Fukushima incident, and we had 7 Mile Island, and there have been other nuclear problems.
Can I put that in perspective a little bit too?
Right.
Because Arnie just mentioned something about nuclear energy. And if you look at what the potential could be if a facility does melt down, I don't want to imagine what the amount of possible health and death issues could be. But if you actually look at how many people have died or been affected when there has been a nuclear accident compared to coal-fired plants on a global basis, there's no comparison. So one of the things about having a discussion is getting perspective, getting information to be able to assess accurately a discussion so that it's not just one-sided. And I will fully admit I have a bias positively towards nuclear energy in terms of meeting and reducing carbon emissions, because there is no scalable entity that produces electricity without emissions that nuclear energy does at this current time. There's problems, there's issues, there's storage, so nothing is ever without issues. But if you're looking at base load, and what I mean by base load is supplying a continuous ongoing supply of electric generation when you need it at night and day, and not polluting, nuclear energy is one of the bridges to this alternative energy
and
future.
it's not talked about all that
Right.
much, although there are 437 nuclear reactors in the world, and 99 of them are in the United States. We have almost 100 of them operating here. So, it is a proven model, and we've had one incident.
India, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, which has vast amounts of oil. I think it's either Kuwait or one of the Emirates is going to be building a nuclear facility. And of course, everybody's favorite, Iran.
Yeah, right.
You know.
There was another question for more, wasn't there?
Yes,
Someone
and
else had
the
a
gentleman in the orange shirt.
Orange shirt.
If there is so many of these companies that are producing electricity in China, what is the most pollution coming from?
Dr. Layton, would you like to
Well,
address that?
I think most of it is coming from coal. I mean, as Arnie was saying, a lot of times, and you'll see this too, and the same thing happens in Montana, and we have a problem in that we have an excess, an abundance of energy, and you can look to wind, you can look to the sun. I did not know this. We have 1/3 of America's coal, and transmission becomes an issue. So. Right now, we have so much renewable energy resources, we don't have the transmission to get it out of Montana. I've been approached by actually a gentleman from Belgium who has a large plot of land here in Montana, and he would love to build wind turbines. He would love to build wind turbines and pipe that energy out of Montana down to, say, Las Vegas, maybe to California. Washington, for example, says, hey, we don't want dirty energy anymore. We want renewable energy, but we need to actually put in the copper, put in the infrastructure so that we can do that. Back in China, back to your question, they may not have that option. They're sort of taking the cheap and dirty route, taking the coal that we're giving to them, but then they have to live with it because they'll say, hey, well, we've got the city here, the manufacturing plant here that's using all this electricity, needs all that energy. The coal-fired power plant better be nearby so that we don't have to build all those long transmission lines that Montana's kind of having the problems with.
You're going to see, I don't want to focus exclusively on China. I mean, you're going to see a lot of this in other developing countries. There's 1.5 billion people on this planet that don't have electricity.
It's actually 2 billion people do not have access to any electricity. Another 3 billion people have intermittent access to electricity, which means that they get it, but it may not be there several hours during the day.
And how many in India?
Well, in India, you've got 400 million people have no access to electricity, living in about 20,000 villages. So this is another discussion for another day in terms of political disruption, economic, and all the
But
issues that
India is
come with
importing
this.
more and more coal,
Right.
and building more and more coal-powered plants because they're the easiest to,
Well, it's
to
the
do.
cheapest resource to
Right.
provide the most economical access to power. So let's go back to what Dr. Layton was saying just a minute ago. You have to understand, countries have certain resources within their base. China does not have the abundance of oil and natural gas that we have here. It's not to say they may not, but what they do have is coal. And just a little side story. Under the regime of Mao, going back to the 1950s and 1960s, you have to know where China was to appreciate where China is today. There was, by, I would say, doctrine, between 30 and 40 million people starved in China in the late 1950s and in the 1960s. So just to kind of think about this, this is a country that not too many decades ago went through massive disruption of its population, massive starvation due to terrible governmental policies. So the Chinese right now are moving in a direction that's hell-bent on just upgrading the standard of living. And sometimes the resources that they're using are what's available and what provides the cheapest, most economical way to generate what's needed to serve this increasing standard of living.
I just want to make everybody aware that it's closing in on 10 o'clock, and so I want to get to our other schools for questions.
I'm sorry.
That's
we've
okay.
just been-
It's such a great topic. There's so much to say. I also want to let the schools know, while everyone is still here, because a few of you will have to pop out early, I know, that if your questions did not get answered, if you email those questions or have your teachers email those to me, I will pass them on to our panel, and we can continue this discussion via email, because there's some really important things and topics that we've been discussing
So
today.
we've got a couple of minutes.
We have a couple minutes.
So
We have
let's
about 5
ask
more
our
minutes.
schools,
Yep.
what have you learned today? What are some of the things that opened your eyes that may have surprised you? What do you take away from this?
Let's go down to Gardner.
There was one question from the guy in the black T-shirt at Moore.
Who's somebody?
Unless Gardner's. Oh, here's
Gardner.
Yeah.
It's working. I think we were most surprised about just the buildings and the amount of pollution that goes on in China, because usually you only hear about the biggest cities, and there are definitely other cities that are underrepresented for the amount of pollution we produce daily, and just all of the products that come out of China and just go worldwide is quite amazing, and I don't think people in America realize how much of that comes from China.
Right.
Yep.
Absolutely. Let's move over to Stanford.
Stanford, what do we got? You got a big group there.
Talk to us.
Let me hear something.
They're doing a little pre-conversing.
I don't know if they're.
Are they cooked? Are they?
Here we go.
I think they're connected.
Sure. What'll it take to change? What do you guys think will take to change the American attitude toward things like bicycles, where they're regarded as something for?
Well, I think it's one of those things where you just have to lead by example. You know, I for a while I would kind of get angry about it and say, gosh, why don't more people ride their bikes? But you know, having community groups like Free Cycles, we're really lucky to have guys like Bob Giordano in town, and just leading by example. You know, as we
It takes
see,
time, doesn't it?
And as we see, you know, people want to move here for our quality of life. They come and see Portland, they come and see Missoula. Like, gosh, you know, these guys have kind of figured it out, and we don't have to have maybe these insecurities over energy security. Just use your own human power. I think there's a big key to just starting with yourself and your own behavior, and people will follow. Is my answer to that.
Right, and you know, as it becomes cooler to do, I mean, I know somebody who is a billionaire who just bought a Tesla.
Okay.
Not because they're concerned about energy consumption, because their other car is an Escalade.
Sure.
It's because it's a cool
That's
car.
right, yeah.
Right.
You know, and Tesla's going to be coming out in 2017 with a $35,000 version,
Right.
which will make it much more accessible to average people.
Yep.
And they'll be cool, and people will start moving to electric cars and then buy. I mean, you lead by example. You lead by making it cool and trendy and hip and popular, and it starts happening.
Yep.
Good question. Good questions, Tim.
Good question.
Do you have any others, or should we?
There was one more.
More?
More. I don't know. Unless Stanford had another one.
Go ahead. Go ahead, more.
Okay, for our takeaway, we kind of noticed that China limits a lot of things, but they're not exactly controlling the pollution that people are outputting.
No, they're not. They have made a political determination that economic growth and keeping their economy churning at 7 or 8% growth a year, which is staggeringly high. I mean, the U.S. economy grew this last quarter by 0.2%.
Yeah, how's that policy working?
If we do 2% a year, we're happy.
Right.
They've grown at 7 or 8% or higher for the last decade or so. That they need energy to drive that, and they're building more nuclear and they're doing other things, but it's predominantly reliant on coal.
We got a gentleman right there, black T-shirt. You got your hand up.
Yes.
So if we have so many alternatives to pollution, then why aren't we using them?
That is a fantastic question. I asked the same question back in 2004 or 5. That was the paper that I started out with in 2008. And gosh, as Arnie just said, a lot of it comes down to money. A lot of it comes down to a little bit of economics, and unfortunately, a lot of times we just go with the quick and dirty solution. And I think in a lot of ways we do have the luxury in this country to come up with some really neat technologies. In fact, there's a new technology I just came out of Stanford where they're using similar photovoltaic technology to bring in radiation from the sun that actually creates a cooling effect and shoots back radiation through the CO2 spectrum. So as Bob was saying earlier, we have the luxury now of developing technologies that can solve a lot of the problems that our dirty ones are. So, and that's where our science, technology, engineering, math.
But what's happening on the other side is with fracking like we're doing in Montana and North Dakota, and producing an abundance, or in some cases an overabundance of oil and natural gas, with oil prices down in the $2.50 range or lower. The pressure is off.
Right.
If you go to Canada, some of you you go to Canada, it's $6, $7, $8 a gallon for gasoline even now. And they're more concerned about their energy consumption.
Yeah.
When cigarettes went to $15 or $20 a pack, that probably had as much of an effect on stopping smoking as the warning on the side.
It created a heck of a black market for cigarettes, too.
Exactly.
And I will be in Dr. Layton's class early in May, and this is one of the issues that I would like to focus on, exactly to your question, because this is very complicated.
It's a perfect question.
It's not a simple answer.
Nope.
There's many different segments that you have to kind of understand in terms of economics, politics, availability of resource, infrastructure, regulatory environment. So there's a multitude of issues that go into this funnel that then come down into what and why and how we use energy and resources. I will tell you these changes are coming.
Right.
They may not come fast enough for some people. They may come in different forms than what we expect them to be, but they are taking place.
And let's not forget, the big oil and gas companies don't want you to use less of their product. They have their own self-interest at stake, and they have a lot of money to spend to educate and advise and influence the public, to their betterment.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, folks, it's been just wonderful to spend some time with you. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day. Hope we've given you a little bit more insight and education to the world, and we'll see you again.
Yeah, and again, come to that summer practicum in June if you get a chance. Send me an email. Nice seeing you all.
Yeah.
Take
Take
care.
care. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.